5,
4,
3,
2,
1. But who's counting, right?
And his name is Major.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen,
please welcome Major Garrett.
From the nation's capital.
Major, fantastic.
It's The Takeout.
This is a major achievement.
With CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent,
Major Garrett, yes, CBS, yes, hi.
Major Garrett.
Major, that's nonsense, and you should know better.
Is Major out of the doghouse?
The answer is yes.
welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I'm Major Garrett. This is The Takeout. Happy election week. We had a successful election on Tuesday. Some results still pending, as you well know. For audience members in California, Arizona, Nevada, they are still counting. There are very close races there. But I will just say this. America, the process worked. Millions of Americans cast ballots. Hundreds of thousands of Americans worked as poll workers. Election administrators did their task as they're supposed to, under sometimes threat, heavy scrutiny, a lot of dark energy. But this election, in every sense of the word, was an American success story. Not a political success story. Yes, there are winners and losers, but an American success story. And for everyone who is involved at the level of election administration and poll working and poll observing, I thank you. I want to talk to our special guest, who is the governor of North Carolina, Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. Governor, thanks for indulging me that brief editorial at the top, but I've written a book called The Big Truth, which talks about election administration, how we do it in this country. It's a really important issue to me. Thanks for letting me do that editorial. It's great to have you on the show.
So I'm so glad you did, because just the other day, I was talking to some poll workers. They have been under tremendous stress, abuse. It is extraordinary what has happened since Trump was elected and how ferocious people can be. We've had a number of people leave the election process. But you know, everyday Americans are stepping up. I talked to a friend of mine who just retired from a well-paying job, who decided, I'm going to go to work for the Chatham County Board of Elections to make sure that these elections run smoothly. She called me the other day, said, you know, this is hard work, but the people who are doing this are amazing. So thank you for thanking them, because our democracy could not survive without people who are willing to step up and do those jobs.
And Governor, indulge me 5 or 10 more other seconds. I want to thank those Democrats and Republicans, some of whom on the Republican side raised questions or were flat out deniers, but who saw the election results and conceded in public. Concession is not an act of weakness. Concession is an act of strength and faith in our country. And the whole process of democratic policy disputes and wrangling depends on the peaceful transference of authority. And that comes with a key intervening moment, a moment of recognizing you tried your best and you lost, and you concede publicly. To those who did that, I want to thank them. So Governor, give me your assessment. You were watching things very closely. I'm sure you were not up for re-election, but there were competitive races in North Carolina. Give me your 360 interpretation of the midterm results as we know them.
Well, sure. I think overall, it defied expectations, and particularly for Democratic governors across the country. I'm chair of the Democratic Governors Association this year. I took that on because I know that governors are often the last line of defense in protecting our rights and freedoms, but they're also the first chance at progress. So I wanted to make sure that my Democratic colleagues across the country and our candidates had the best support that they could get. And it turned out that it was the best midterm for a president's party when it comes to governor's races since 1986. And I believe it was because that Democratic governors let the people tell them what mattered to them, not the other way around. We understood that voters were not one-dimensional. We understood that with this horrible U.S. Supreme Court decision that ripped away women's reproductive freedom that had been in place for 5 decades, that now the state capitals and the state legislatures were really going to be determining a constitutional right. Now, your zip code should not affect your constitutional rights, but that is where we are now. So the importance of governors was so important, but we also knew that governors were doing things to lower costs to families, like cutting food taxes and giving them auto insurance rebates. And I think the governors, the people rewarded Democratic governors across this country, and they got the job done. And we know the history of a midterm and a president's party and how awful that can be. And I think overall, we defied history here.
Well, two Republican governors did you a favor in that regard, in Massachusetts and in Maryland, by not running again, Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker, and Democrats won both of those seats. Those were sort of assumed to be victories. Wes Moore is a historic figure, first African-American governor in the history of Maryland. And what other governor's races did you have your eye on, and would you circle on the map as important of what you just described or indicative of what you just described?
Well, first, let me give a nod to Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, and Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, two Republican governors with whom I worked very well. Governors had to go through a lot over the last 4 years. We had a pandemic, and then we had to deal with a president and President Trump who vacillated between indifference and obstruction. Governors had to step up. We then saw global inflation that we had to deal with. We saw the attack on the Capitol, the attack on democracy. We saw the court stripping away fundamental rights for reproductive freedom. So governors had a lot to do, and we spent time talking with each other, meeting with each other, and planning. And Governor Hogan was very strong. He was leading the governors, the National Governors Association, both parties, through that effort, and stood up to the White House when he needed to. And of course, he's term limited. And I'm so happy Wes Moore is elected. What a strong candidate, combat veteran, businessman, Rhodes Scholar. He's going to be a super governor. But then you got Charlie Baker, who was not term limited in Massachusetts. He never said this to me, but I'm speculating that he thought that with today's Trump-owned Republican Party, that he couldn't get the nomination for governor. Now, maybe he could have, I don't know, but that's what I think. And so now we have the tremendous historic election of Maura Healey, who's former Attorney General. I was Attorney General of North Carolina. We served together. I know she's going to be a fantastic governor. But when you look at governors that really matter, let's look at the big swing states that we know it's critical to protect the democracy. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, term limited. Josh Shapiro is the perfect candidate and will be an outstanding governor, and will stand up to those shenanigans and will help protect democracy and women's reproductive freedom in the Commonwealth. Michigan and Wisconsin, a Democrat hasn't been elected governor while a Democratic president was in office for decades in either one of those states. And both of them, their competence, their willingness to listen to the people were shining through. And I think that the people of Michigan and Wisconsin saw them as leaders who cared about their kitchen table issues, their costs, but also were going to step up to protect democracy and reproductive freedom. Look at Kansas with Laura Kelly, a very red state. She gets reelected because she believes in common sense government. We are waiting for results in Arizona, clearly an important state. It's one that we would flip if Katie Hobbs is able to hang on in this election. So we know that there were many important governor's races across the country. In fact, 36 of them. We had 13 incumbents to defend. Right now, even if you don't even count even if we lost the two remaining races, which I don't think we will, but even if we did, Democratic governors now represent more than 54% of the American people. That's a good thing.
So we're going to have to take a break right now, Governor Roy Cooper. When we come back from the break, I want to talk to you about some other governors that also got attention. And I also want to talk to you about Democratic success that might have caught some people by surprise at the state legislative level. But we're going to talk about Ron DeSantis and Governor Greg Abbott, big winners in Texas and Florida, respectively. When we come back, I'm Major Garrett. New York, no, not New York, North Carolina Democratic Governor Roy Cooper is our special guest. Back in just 1 second.
Republicans have always been masterful at being able to do that, playing on people's fears.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to The Takeout. North Carolina Democratic Governor Roy Cooper is our special guest, head of the Democratic Governors Association. So Ron DeSantis won big. He won early in Florida. He also won Miami-Dade County. That is suggesting to people like me, Governor, that Florida and its 30 electoral votes in the 2024 election may be out of the reach of Democrats, whomever the Democratic Party nominee is. Do you think that's true?
No, I don't think it's true. It's very disappointing to see his brand of politics get affirmation in Florida. But I do believe that in the right year with the right candidates, that Florida can still be in play for Democrats. We certainly do not want to write it off.
And Greg Abbott won, cruised to re-election in Texas over someone who is very well known in Democratic circles, a true blue fundraiser nationwide, Beto O'Rourke. What are your takeaways from that result?
You know, again, disappointing. We knew, though, that with this environment that we were going to face, with the history of the president's party's first midterm, with the Biden favorability numbers, with inflation and people paying more at the gas pump and the grocery store, and people's natural tendency to blame the person at the top and that person's party, that this was going to be a year for headwinds for Democratic candidates. And one of the hardest things to do in politics is to defeat an incumbent governor. Governors do so much work that affect people's everyday lives. And even if you're not such a good governor, it's still hard to root one out. And this just was not the time for Democrats to succeed in Texas and Florida. But they are still on Democratic maps. We have to go in and look at ways that we can improve the processes there. I don't profess to be an expert on how we do that, but I know that both of those states are too important to our country. Too many people live there. We've got to keep working to make sure that we can make some inroads in both of those states.
When you hear Governor DeSantis, as he said in his election victory speech, Florida is where woke comes to die, what do you think he's driving at? And do you think that is a structural problem Democrats need to address there or anywhere else?
Well, it's divisive, extreme politics playing on people's fears. Republicans have always been masterful at being able to do that, playing on people's fears. And what we have to do is take those issues head on. Education, the classroom is not a place for culture wars. We need to teach science and history and math and reading, and we don't need to put our children in the middle of that. I think we can take that on, and we have successfully taken that on in many states across the country. In North Carolina, they introduced a Don't Say Gay bill modeled after what they had done in Florida. I was able to veto it. Our Democrats in the state legislature were able to sustain that veto. People care more about their children getting quality education and learning to read and that they're safe at school than those issues. And I think overall, we Democrats can continue to focus on those things. That's what matters.
So on this program last week, I played my interview recorded October 29th in Santa Fe, New Mexico with Governor Gavin Newsom, someone I believe you're pretty well familiar with. And he said to me, I asked him, do you think a red wave is coming? He said, it certainly feels that way. Again, that was October 29th. He said he felt the headwinds nationally, been traveling around because his reelection bid was very safe in California. He was nervous about House races in California. Turns out that worry for Democrats is well-founded. There are many close House races that may determine actually majority control of that body. But he also said something in more dramatic ways that you just hinted at. He said, and I quote, Democrats are getting crushed on narrative, and they get crushed over and over and over by what he described, again, a direct quote, ruthless Republican Party that defines issues in ways that Democrats, he said, find themselves continually on defense. And he said, my party has to understand what it's up against, number one, these are his words, not mine, and number two, how to counter this narrative that he said crushes Democrats more often than not. Do you agree?
Democrats are very good at getting things done. We're not always good at how we talk about them. And
why is that?
Well, I think we are busy getting things done. When you look at, and President Biden would tell you this himself, when you look at what has been done in Washington in the last 18 months, compared to the history of Congress and what's happened, stunning amount of investments that are going to be made in the American people in lowering childcare costs and connecting people to high-speed internet and fixing roads and bridges and moving us into the clean energy future and capping the cost of prescription drugs for seniors and capping insulin cost and just issue after issue that matter to everyday people, working hard on it, fighting with each other on how to do it.
There's a
consumes
a
a
fair
lot
amount
of
of that
our
for
time.
sure.
Yeah. And that's what you guys, and I understand that's where the conflict is. You guys focus on intra-party squabbles about how we're going to get things done. Republicans, Garrett, Major, don't have a plan. They don't have a plan. Their whole reason for being is to criticize, attack, gain power, and essentially what they do is to try to reduce services for people and to give tax breaks to the very wealthiest among us and the corporations. And that's pretty much it. I know that's an oversimplification, but that is what they do. They try to win and to take power, and they don't have a good plan. I think Democratic governors this time did a much better job of communicating to people what they were doing to affect the issues that matter. And it was multidimensional. We heard a lot of pundits as, these swing states came up, the polls would swing one way or the other, and everybody was looking at it, and everybody had an answer as to what issue was motivating people. And this is what was swinging the polls one way or the other. The fact of the matter remained that Democratic governors remained steady in what they were doing and what they were messaging as well, affecting the cost to families, which they cared about, but also reminding people that, hey, democracy's on the brink, and we know that people's abortion rights are going to get swept away if we don't elect Democratic governors. The combination of those issues won the day for Democratic governors. I'm not sure that polls necessarily were able to capture what motivated voters. We think it was a combination of things. So yes, we need to keep working on the way we talk about things. Yes, we have to stand up to the rhetoric and the attacks that Republicans put upon us, but we can never take our eye off the ball of getting things done, making things happen, working for the least among us, and not spend so much time worrying about just the message. Oftentimes results speak for themselves. We like to think that. We know that that's not necessarily the case. So we do need to get better.
So we got about a minute, Governor, before we go to our next break. So this conversation will clearly carry on into our third segment, but I want to start it off. President Biden, should he run for re-election?
Well, I expect him to. I had a conversation with him just a couple of days ago. I support him. He's been a fantastic president. I've told him that I will try to win North Carolina. And if he needs to make that decision, but if he makes the decision, yes, I'm for him 100%.
What effect do these midterms have on that calculus within the Democratic Party writ large?
It's hard to say. I think the results that were achieved in Washington helped what happened out across America. It helped in what happened with these races. I do believe that people are deeply concerned about another Trump being president or someone Trump-like, and that possibility is very, very real. We know the president has a track record of being able to stop Trump in his tracks. He'll have a track record of 4 years of success. These next 2 years, obviously, are going to be a lot tougher.
Let me stop you right there, Governor. We
Yep.
need to run to a break. I will continue this conversation on the other side of that. I'm Major Garrett. That is North Carolina Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. Back for more of the Takeout in just 1 second.
One thing I've known about Joe Biden for a long time, you can never, ever count him out.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to the Takeout. We had to go to a break, but I want to let the governor continue. Roy Cooper, Democratic Governor of North Carolina, continue your thoughts about not only where President Biden finds himself. I'll tell you, in Washington, in the last 36 hours, the feeling among Democrats I've talked to is the president is in a better position than he would be had there been a 240-seat House Republican majority or the prospect of one, and maybe a 52 or 53 Senate Republican majority. That these results, muddled though they are, mean he has a fighting chance and is viewed with a bit more confidence by Democrats, at least here in the nation's capital, than they were viewing him even on Saturday or Sunday of this past weekend.
Well, and I think that's absolutely true, but I felt the same way even as we went into this election and before we even knew the results. And the reason I felt that way is because of the extraordinary success that we saw through Congress and what this administration was able to bring to bear. And one thing I've known about Joe Biden for a long time, you can never, ever count him out. You can never count him out. He always finds a way to get where he wants to go. And I think if he decides that, and it seems to me that he's going to decide that he wants to run, then I'm going to work hard to win North Carolina for him. And he can once again help to save the country if Trump is the nominee on the Republican side, for sure. And even if he's not.
Give me your sense of what happened in the Senate race in North Carolina. There is a conversation, which I know you are aware of, Governor, that the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee did not invest enough in North Carolina. And if it had, the result might have been different.
Well, it didn't. I will say this, as chair of the Democratic Governors Association, I understand how tough decisions have to be made, and that your organizations seek to protect incumbents first. And obviously there were a lot of incumbents that were on the line here. So that being said, yes, if there had been a greater investment here, Sherry Beasley, whom I appointed as Chief Justice of our state Supreme Court, she's an extraordinary candidate, and it's too bad that she lost. I will tell you this, a lot of good things happened in North Carolina aside from her loss. Number one, we now have a 7-7 congressional delegation, which is pretty extraordinary. And you would think in a 50-50 state, well, that's what it should be. We've been dealing with Republican redistricting that's technologically diabolical, and I'll put our Republican legislature against any Republican legislature in the country as to how awful districts can be. I'll just give you an example. Back when we had 13, they drew districts in a way that came out 10-3 Republican. And someone asked the chair who had drawn the maps, how in the world could you have in a 50-50 state 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats going to Congress? And he said, because we couldn't figure out a way to make it 11-2. He said that in public, and it was part of the evidence in the case that was decided on partisan gerrymandering. But now our state Supreme Court ruled that their districts were too partisan and they had to redraw them. Now so we picked up 2 members of Congress in this battle for control of the House. So that is a positive thing. And by a very narrow margin, we were able to keep the number of Democrats that I need in our state legislature to sustain my veto, which is really important, particularly.
You did that just by a hair, but you did it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's important because we've become an access point for abortion in the southeastern United States. And so that was important. It's going to be a harder fight to uphold my vetoes because we have a very narrow margin, but we hope the people can help put a spotlight on the North Carolina legislature to try to make sure that we protect voting rights, that we protect women's reproductive freedom. So good things happened in North Carolina in a tough atmosphere. And I think things are looking up in our state for 2024, 2026 as we go forward.
So, Governor, you know, one of the conversations in Democratic circles for the last 4 or 5 years has been what is happening in state legislatures. And it appears in this midterm cycle, there was a bit of a bounce back because there was some more tactical investment, there was more recruitment, there was more eyes on state legislative races. And I'd like your assessment of Wisconsin in that regard, Michigan, and any other state that you think highlights a trend worth paying attention to on that front.
Well, to step back a minute, and if we're going to criticize the Democratic Party like my friend Governor Newsom did, we have for decades not paid enough attention to state governors, state races, and state legislative races. Republicans for decades have paid attention to it and have gained a control in a lot of states where they shouldn't. I think Democrats have been waking up to that, particularly when President Trump came along, the Supreme Court started ripping rights away. We now have more issues that are being decided on the state level. So this time, I think Democrats paid significantly more attention to state governors and what's happening in state legislatures. In mine, I had to raise millions of dollars to help our candidates keep that number that we needed because the courts haven't helped us much on our state legislative races, and they're terribly gerrymandered. But I am excited about things that have happened across the country along with electing Democratic governors that are positive. And I hope we Democrats learn that this is where we need to maintain investment and attention, because if that U.S. Supreme Court is going to be there for quite a while. We don't know what's coming down the road regarding personal rights and freedoms that may be decided at the state level. Who the governor is, who the state legislature is in those states are going to matter a lot to everyday people.
So I know the audience doesn't like to hear this, Governor, but you know it's true. I know it's true. The 2024 presidential campaign began starting Wednesday morning of this week. The president in his press conference at the White House said that he will be enjoying watching Ron DeSantis and former President Trump go at one another. Will you? And what do you think will become of that conflict should it actually be for the Republican presidential nomination?
I've given up trying to predict what happens in the Republican Party. You know, I work closely with Republicans in North Carolina. I think people expect us to try and work together on solutions, and I continue to do that. But since President Trump got elected, it's unfortunate that a majority of the Republican Party has pretty much told us that they prefer an autocracy as long as their guy is in charge. And President Trump, the candidates he supported had a bad night, no question about it. The issue is whether that's going to transfer to a bad thing for Trump, because he's already saying that it was a very successful night. And he's saying that those who lost didn't deny the election in 2020 enough. So he's already started his spin on it, as he always does. As to whether Governor DeSantis will give him a run in the primary, I don't know. I fully expect Trump to run. I think it's hard for me to predict Republican politics, but Governor DeSantis has an uphill fight, because it's going to be hard to strip away those people, because not enough Republicans have had the courage to stand up to him. They just haven't, and we'll see if that changes.
As you know, Governor, in 2016 and 2020, Trump carried North Carolina. He would be the odds-on favorite to carry in 2024, would he not?
No, he will not. He will not. One thing I know is that I ran for governor in 2016 and 2020, and I won at the same time that Trump won North Carolina. I know the people here. I do not believe that North Carolina will make that mistake again. I've always considered North Carolina to be the fullback of the National Democratic football team, in that Republicans have to win North Carolina in order to gain the presidency. Democrats don't necessarily have to win North Carolina in order to become president. So what happens is that the Republicans pour a ton of money and spend a ton of time in North Carolina. There was a Trump here almost every other day in both of those elections. They had to spend a lot of time here during the process. That's resources and time that's taken away from Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and all of these other states that we can win. I just want us being the fullback, maybe that we can get the ball one time and actually score the touchdown like we did for President Obama in 2008.
Using football metaphors in politics, always a successful strategy. That is the voice of Roy Cooper, Democratic governor of North Carolina. When we come back in our last segment, we're going to get in the weeds on something that is really important. And I'm going to give you this hint: Moore versus Harper. We're going to talk about that in segment 4. I'm Major Garrett. Stay tuned for segment 4 of The Takeout in just 1 second.
The legislature could pass a law to say we get to decide who our presidential electors are.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to The Takeout. You know, in this audience are people who know that I love to nerd out on things that matter, that catch some headlines, but maybe not as many headlines as they should. Moore versus Harper. And don't listen to me on this. Listen to Michael J. Ludig, one of the most revered and respected conservative legal thinkers in our country, has said, what the Supreme Court does in this upcoming case will be among the most fundamental decisions made in the history of American jurisprudence as it regards interpreting the Constitution. Before he was governor of North Carolina, my guest, Roy Cooper, was the attorney general there. I'm pretty sure he's well-versed on this topic. Governor, explain to my audience the importance of Moore versus Harper.
So this is a scary undercurrent that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but as the hearing date approaches in the U.S. Supreme Court, we're going to be talking about it more. What happened is that our state Supreme Court, as I mentioned earlier, ruled that the Republican congressional districts were unconstitutional because they were excessively partisan. That led to a 7-7 result this time, which is the kind of thing that should happen. But that was a decision under our Constitution. The state legislature, the Republicans in the legislature, have sued, claiming that federal law has left the decision on how to run federal elections and how to draw congressional districts solely to the state legislature. They're taking a very narrow reading of that. It's always been assumed that it's the state, not necessarily the state legislature. That means if the governor has a veto, the governor can veto it. It means that the state court, if it finds it's a violation of the state constitution, the state court can do something about it, as they did here. What they are saying is that we solely should be able to run federal elections in our state. That's leaving the fox to guard the hen house and could be catastrophic for this country if the court makes that decision. Now, you would hope that it wouldn't, because we had a similar case. Like I said, our legislature is the worst on drawing congressional districts. So we'd already been in the Supreme Court and said there should be a federal ruling that you can't have districts that are overly partisan. The Supreme Court backed away, and Chief Justice Roberts said that should be the states who decide that, not the federal government. It's too hard for us to decide whether it's partisan. Now a state court has done that. You would hope that he would come back in and say, we agree with that. But with this Supreme Court, they may leave the power on running federal elections to just state legislatures, and their Republican legislatures will run with that in a way that is scary.
And Governor, let me play that out. And I'm not predicting this. I don't know what the court's going to do, and I don't know what the implications of its ruling would be. But there are some who fear if this independent state legislator theory is sanctified constitutionally by the Supreme Court, that could even impact electoral vote certification.
No doubt. No doubt. It could.
Explain my audience how that could be.
Well, so this is the Trump game plan. The Trump game plan was to ignore the popular vote of swing states and have those Republican legislatures in those states decide who the presidential electors would be. If this Supreme Court would want to go down this road and read this as narrowly as Republicans want them to read it, then the legislature could pass a law to say, we get to decide who our presidential electors are, or they could be more crafty than that. But eventually they could be the ultimate decision makers. We could be guided by the public or whatever they would want to say.
Right.
And they could actually ignore the will of the people. That's the danger there. They also could have control on how federal elections are conducted. So you might even have different rules for state elections and local elections and federal elections if they run this out. We don't know that they will. We've filed amicus briefs. We're working really hard to fight this case and hope the decision is favorable, but it is a really dangerous one that, as you say, a bipartisan group of legal scholars have looked at this and said this could be a rabbit hole that this country does not want to go down.
So my audience consists of independents, Democrats, Republicans, and to the Republicans in my audience, I was going to offer you a practical assessment of this midterm election as it regards this question. Because right now we don't know who's going to control the House of Representatives, but we know that Republicans are going to gain some seats in New York, and we know they've already gained 4 seats in Florida. Let me explain in a non-esoteric way how that happened. The state legislature in Florida offered a map drawing of congressional districts to Republican Governor Ron DeSantis. He rejected it. He drew his own lines, so not a state legislature, a governor. And then he went before the court and said, ratify that, and the court did, eradicating African-American districts in Florida and creating 4 net Republican districts. That happened outside the state legislature. So even if you think this is a theory is a great idea, that's not how it worked in Florida. Right. In New York, the Democratic Party drew the lines and the state court got involved and said, no, those are too partisan in gerrymandering, redrew the lines, and Republicans are gaining in New York. So as Republicans think about this, just at a practical level, your gains so far achieved in 2 states had nothing to do with strategists, speechwriters, or candidates. It had to do with the way the lines were drawn. And in both cases, your gains resulted not from legislatures. Governor, take that ball and run with it.
Well, I think the answer is that independent redistricting commissions have shown to be the best way to do this, because what is happening in these states is that politicians are choosing their constituents instead of the other way around. And there are numerous diabolical ways to do this. And both parties have engaged in this over the years. You know, there's been a lot of bipartisan work to get independent redistricting commissions in place in states across the country. And we have some that are extremely successful. You know, this decision we're talking about could potentially affect that. So the way lines are drawn, clearly problematic. No one knows better than those of us in North Carolina who've had to deal with it. I'm dealing with it right now with the state legislature that is right on the razor's edge of a supermajority. So we've got to find a better way to do this. And there is a better way. We just got to try to pull people together to get that done.
Last question. Trump, Biden, who wins?
Biden.
Landslide? Bigger than 2020?
You know, because he will get significantly more overall votes but it's going to come down to these individual swing states and how they work. We've laid a lot of wonderful groundwork in those swing states to protect the democratic system, to make sure that voting is as fair as possible. Democratic governors are going to be ensuring that in those swing states. One of the reasons why I'm continuing to cross my fingers about Arizona's results with Katie Hobbs over Kerry Lake. We don't know how that's going to turn out.
Right.
But yes, I believe that he's going to win this thing, and I don't even know what a landslide is anymore, but I'm not sure we have those anymore in our country.
Less and less and less. That's the voice
Yes.
of Democratic Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina. That concludes our takeout for our radio audience, for those on CBS News Streaming and on our podcast platform. Stay tuned for the Takeout Outtake Especial. We'll see you next week.
I'm a new wave rock and roll guy. That's where I was when I was in college. The Cars, music like that's pretty good.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. We have Democratic North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper. Governor, real quick, the midterm elections showed that governors like Gavin Newsom in California, like Ron DeSantis in Florida, who had diametrically different and rhetorically different approaches to COVID, both cruised to re-election. Was there a referendum in this midterm on COVID adaptations or steps governors took?
No, I don't think so. I think the vast majority of the people in this country believe that steps were taken in order to save lives, and millions of lives were saved to take those steps, and I'm glad that we did. And also Democratic governors across this country worked really hard to get us back into shape with the economy and work with businesses and got the job done.
We have 3 threshold questions we ask everyone on this. I'd love to get your answers to it. So your most influential book in your life, all-time favorite movie, and if you're driving around North Carolina and it's a long drive and you're going to listen to some good music, what music, artist, or genre is that going to be?
Oh, man. Well, probably To Kill a Mockingbird book and movie. And for music, you know, I'm a new wave rock and roll guy. That's where I was when I was in college. The Cars, music like that's pretty good.
I didn't have you down as a new wave rock aficionado, Governor. That's a nice surprise.
Yeah. You don't want to see me dance. I can guarantee you that.
And very quickly, because it's been said before on this show, several people have mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird, both book and movie. Why for you?
Well, you know, I think it shows that we have to continually deal with racism, systemic racism that is still in this country today. And all of us must come together, recognize it, and take steps to deal with it. It's why I've appointed a task force on racial equity and criminal justice, why we are taking steps to make sure that law enforcement are trained and working to gain trust in community. And this has to happen across our economy. I'm pleased that companies are continuing to recognize more and more that diversity increases the bottom line, that we are better, that our results are better when we are diverse. And I think we need to do everything in our power to combat racism in all forms.
It also strikes me, Governor, it is a book and a movie about 2 vital aspects of humanity, compassion and courage.
No doubt.
Governor Roy Cooper, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for hanging out with us at the Takeout. We'll see you on the road.
Thanks a lot, Major. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right.
We'll see you next week, everybody.